This is the third week in a row of NVIDIA launching RTX 40 Super Series graphics cards. Today I'm going to be reviewing the top-end one, the RTX 4080 Super, which is right here. But this is also the culmination of a lot of benchmarking that I've been doing over the past week plus in order to get you numbers for not just the RTX 4080 Super, but also the RTX 4070 Ti Super that I did a brief review of last week, and the RTX 4070 Super, which I missed because it launched very quickly after returning from CES. So today we'll be looking at benchmark results from 10 different graphics cards, 13 different tests. I've got ray tracing on and ray tracing off performance. I have cost per frame results so you can quickly tell the value proposition between the cards. And I of course have timestamps in the video description down below so you can jump to the part you most want to see. Let's get started. Excellent! Today's video is brought to you by the Paul's Hardware store on paulshardware.net, the only official source for Paul's Hardware merchandise. Tantalizing t-shirts, brilliant beer sets, high-quality hoodies, and more, all featuring the classic thumbscrew for tasteful and refined viewers, or the 8-bit thumbscrew for tasteful and refined viewers who hate curves. New designs are added sporadically and at random, so head over to paulshardware.net and get some of that sweet, sweet merch right now. Or not right now, after you watch the video. Either way. Before we get into the numbers, let's start by talking about what NVIDIA has been doing with the 80 class card in their lineup for several years now. The RTX 3080 was a very popular graphics card that debuted for a $700 MSRP, but it also launched just as the GPU cryptocurrency mining craze was getting into full swing, which meant it was very difficult to find for its MSRP, and the price quickly ramped up to $800 or $1,000 or more on the secondary market. A couple years later, when NVIDIA launched the RTX 40 series, they decided, those high prices due to cryptocurrency mining sure are nice for how much money we've been making. So why don't we make the next gen RTX 4080, the successor to the 3080, like $1,200, about a $500 markup over the $700 MSRP of its predecessor. Now I can't speak to the actual sales of the RTX 4080 at $1,200, but I do know that it wasn't insanely popular. It was a really difficult price to swallow for anyone but people who are buying the highest tier of card, and for that class of people, well, you're probably just going to opt for the RTX 4090 instead for around $1,600 to closer to $2,000 these days. Now I've talked quite a few times before about how NVIDIA and lots of companies in the tech space use a technique called anchoring to try to increase the perceived value of their products over time. And NVIDIA has been anchoring the price of the RTX 4080 at $1,200 for a while now. But now that we've all gotten used to that insanely high price for the RTX 4080, the 4080 Super has arrived with a discount. $1,000 instead of $1,200. And that is the biggest selling point of this graphics card, because I'm going to tell you guys right now, it is not much faster at all than the RTX 4080. And in fact, I'm looking at this more like a relaunch of the RTX 4080, but since NVIDIA doesn't like to discount their products because it implies weakness or something like that, they lowered the price of a different product, the RTX 4080 Super, and now it's $1,000. Are we happy about the $1,000 RTX 4080 Super as compared to the $1,200 RTX 4080 non-Super, or are we still miffed at NVIDIA's $500 price bump, and reducing that by $200 isn't really doing a whole lot for us right now? We'll talk a little bit more about that in the conclusion, but I wanted to preface this video with that bit of context. So let's begin with a stat comparison. The RTX 4080 is still based on the AD103 GPU as part of the Ada GPU family, and NVIDIA has bumped up the core count to 10,240 CUDA cores as compared to 9,728 with the RTX 4080. You have a very similar memory configuration with 16 gigs of GDDR6X memory. It's running at a slightly higher frequency, 1,438 megahertz as compared to 1,400 megahertz with the non-Super. So that gives you a 23 gigabits per second effective memory clock as compared to 22.4 gigabits per second with the previous version. Likewise, the design of the card, at least the Founders Edition, hasn't changed very much in terms of the actual build itself. It does have a nice matte black finish now, which I think looks quite clean. And of course, you've got the Super branding on there as well, which is maybe right side up or upside down, depending on how you have the card set down. And of course, you still have the 12 VH power connector that, with the adapter that ships with this card, breaks out into 3 8-pin PCI Express graphics connectors, which is capable of delivering 450 watts of power. As for my comparison testing cards, I have a lot of them. There's actually 10 GPUs total in this roundup. I wanted to add more, but I basically just ran out of time. But we have everything from the top-end RTX 4090 all the way down to the RTX 4070, both the non-Super and the new Super Edition included. And then from AMD, we have their top cards in the Radeon RX 7000 series, the RX 7900 XTX, RX 7900 XT, and RX 7800 XT. RX 7800 XT coming in as the least expensive graphics card in this roundup, still selling close to its original MSRP of $500. Recently, it's dropped by about $10 or $20. Here's also a look at the stats for my test bed that I'm using to test these cards. Going with the AMD Ryzen 7 7800X 3D processor, which is one of the top CPUs for gaming right now, so it's going to get the most performance out of every card possible. Let's begin by taking a look at power draw. We have the GPU power draw for just the GPU by itself, peak across all tests, the average system power draw while gaming, as well as the peak power draw that I saw for the entire system, again across all tests. NVIDIA has maintained a lead in terms of power efficiency for some time now, but AMD has caught up quite a bit, especially with the more efficient manufacturing processes used in the RX 7000 series. The 7800 XT draws the least power from the Radeon lineup, about 340 watts on average, and peaking at about 390 watts for the entire system. Compare that to something like the 4070 Super Founders Edition, which is about 306 on average and 350 for the whole system. Of course, if you go higher up on the NVIDIA side, you get some very powerful cards, but the power draw also increases. They still maintain a fair amount of efficiency, and the Founders Edition 4080 versus the 4080 Super are really right in line with each other, within a few watts, which would be really nice if the 4080 Super is also giving more performance, but as we'll see in a moment, that's not exactly the case. Let's move into our first test, 3D Mark Time Spy Extreme, which is a synthetic that I like to use as a point of reference. Please note that this is not included in my overall cumulative results, and I'm mostly going to be concentrating on the difference between the 4080 Founders Edition and the Super Founders Edition. 14102 versus 14301, very minor difference, about 1.4% improvement for the Super. And then if we roll over to 3D Mark Port Royal, this is a ray tracing focused test where the AMD cards typically don't perform quite as well. Once again, we have a very minor improvement for the Super, getting to 84.1 FPS up from 82.7, which is again about a 1.7% bump. And now we get into the actual gaming benchmarks, starting with Far Cry 6, and I tried to have a nice balance between some older games, some newer games, and ray tracing and non-ray tracing tests. At 4K, the 4080 Super managed 110.3 frames per second, a whole 0.3 FPS improvement over the standard 4080, so not much to speak of there. If we jump over to 2560 by 1440, the 4080 non-Super actually did a little bit better than the Super, 177.2 FPS versus 175.9. This did happen a handful of times during my testing, and although even NVIDIA directly told us, yes, for some games you're only going to see like a 1 to 3% improvement, it still made me double take just a little bit. So if you have a 4080 non-Super that's a good performer, and I think my 4080 non-Super does actually perform and boost itself quite well, then you might find, as I'm showing you guys today, that the 4080 Super is not going to be able to provide much of a bump in terms of performance. So it all comes down to that price drop. Moving on to 1920 by 1080 though, again, the 4080 Super was just a little bit slower than the 4080 non-Super, 202.7 versus 204.2. And that puts it about 0.8% behind. So let's see how things look in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running at 4K, 3840 by 2160. Here the 4080 Super managed to outperform the 4080 non-Super by, again, just a couple frames, 163.6 average FPS, and that's about a 1.4% improvement. Switching over to 1440, the Super maintained a lead, 294.9 FPS, which again is faster, but again, less than 0.5% faster, so it's not all that much of an improvement. Finally, at 1920 by 1080, as you can hopefully see, the numbers are very even, which means we're very CPU bound, so this is pretty much a wash between almost all the cards except for some of the lower end ones. We ran through Shadow of the Tomb Raider one more time with Ray Tracing Ultra mode enabled for Ray Trace shadows, so the frame rates do drop in this case, but we hit 106.8 with the 4080 Super versus 105.5 with the 4080 non-Super. We're about 1.2% faster. Likewise, at 2560 by 1440, we had a very minor improvement, getting up to 198.8 frames per second, and that is again less than 1% improvement. Finally, at 1920 by 1080, we had pretty much the same performance between both cards, 279 average FPS for both. And please note that this is one of 4 of my ray tracing tests. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077. This one I also ran 2 ways with ray tracing on and ray tracing off. This is ray tracing off, so we're looking at rasterization performance. And here again, the 4080 Super wasn't quite able to outpace the non-Super. At 53.9 average frames per second, it is about 1.7% behind. Next up at 2560 by 1440, we have pretty much a wash once again with the 4080 Super behind by just 0.4 FPS. And then at 1920 by 1080, the Super is again behind by about 1 frame. Do note that the Radeon cards are keeping up decently well here in this rasterization only mode, but they're going to fall behind a little bit as we switch over to Cyberpunk 2077 using the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. Here at 4K, all the cards struggle a bit, and do note that I'm not using upscaling with any of these tests. So you do have DLSS and FSR that could get more frames out of these cards, but for the sake of comparison, I'm leaving that out. At the very least, the 4080 Super edged out the 4080 non-Super, getting up to 29.7 FPS. That's a very, very narrow gap. Here's Cyberpunk ray tracing mode at 1440, and once again, pretty much a wash between the two 4080s. They're within 0.3 FPS of one another. And finally at 1920 by 1080, the 4080 non-Super once again pulls out with a win, 93.9 average FPS, so that's about 2.3% faster. To finish off my ray tracing tests, we have F1 2023 next. Using the ultra high preset, has the ray tracing features enabled by default. And here the 4080 Super was able to put out 68.4 average frames per second, and that is about 1.2% faster than the 4080 non-Super. Once again, with ray tracing enabled here, the AMD cards are going to struggle just a little bit more to keep up. Next up at 1440, we have, once again, pretty much a wash between the two 4080s. 124 average frames per second with just a 0.3 frame lead for the 4080 non-Super. Finally at 1920 by 1080, the 4080 Super does come out with the win, 173.1 average FPS, is again about 2% faster than the 4080 non-Super. My final ray tracing title is Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, which I want to call Mists of Pandaria for some reason. But here, once again, we have just the ever so slightest edge by the 4080 Super at 50.1 average FPS. And once again, the AMD cards are struggling a bit to keep up with the ray tracing enabled. Although, you know, the 7900 XTX isn't doing too bad at 46 FPS. At 2560 by 1440, we have a half a frame lead for the 4080 Super. That is about half a percentage point ahead by comparison. And finally at 1920 by 1080, 135.5 FPS with the 4080 non-Super taking the lead once again by half a frame. Next is Horizon Zero Dawn, which we'll have to do until Horizon Forbidden West launches for PC in another month or two. At 4K, the 4080 Super hit 125.7 frames per second on average, again about 1 FPS ahead of the 4080 non-Super, 0.7% improvement. At 2560 by 1440, the non-Super takes the lead once again by 0.3 FPS, so the cards are really staying neck and neck. And finally at 1920 by 1080, we're starting to hit CPU limitations, so the cards are bunched up a bit more. And actually, we're catching up a little bit on the 4090 Founders Edition, although the 4080 non-Super is the one who came closest, followed closely by the 7900 XTX. Next is Total War Warhammer 3, trying to include a variety of games here, including like RTS, racing, and flight sim titles. I really think my 4080 Founders Edition is just an excellent performer. It hit 78.3 average FPS here, which I think was its best win over the 4080 Super. It's about 3.5% ahead. Meanwhile, at 1440, the 4080 Super retakes the lead, hitting 143.3 average frames per second, about a 1.2% improvement over the non-Super. And finally at 1920 by 1080, both cards got up over 200 frames per second, outpaced only by the 7900 XTX and the 4090 Founders Edition. But once again, a wash with just about a 0.3% lead for the 4080 Super here. Continuing on with Resident Evil Village, because I just never got Resident Evil 4, and they're based on the same engine anyway. That said, this is a very consistent title for benchmarking, and once again, the 4080 non-Super takes the win with 166.4 average FPS, which is about 1.8% faster than the 4080 Super. At 2560 by 1440, the 4080 Super got just shy of 300 FPS, 298.7, so here it was maintaining about a 0.8% lead over the non-Super. And then at 1920 by 1080, we're starting to get a little bit CPU bound. Still though, the 4080 non-Super managed to maintain a little bit of the lead, hitting 400.1 average frames per second. Next up we have Doom Eternal, because I like to do a little bit of Vulkan testing as well. This did seem to open up perhaps the best performance improvement by the 4080 Super in these tests, about 2.3% improvement at 277.9 average FPS over the 4080 non-Super. Again at 2560 by 1440, we had a little bit of an edge for the 4080 Super at 504.4 average FPS. It's about 2.6% faster than the non-Super. And finally getting up into the ridiculous frame rate land of 1920 by 1080, we had 633.9 average FPS by the 4080 Super, again maintaining about a 1% lead over the non-Super counterpart. Here's Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 running at 4K. We had 66 average FPS out of the 4080 Super. This one's just really showing the outsized performance of the RTX 4090, I feel like, with both 4080s being within 1% of one another. This game quickly becomes CPU bound at 2560 by 1440 and 1080. So here we actually had the 4090 drop down to 92 FPS, while the 4080 non-Super took the win with 98.2 FPS, followed closely by the 4080 Super at 97.1 FPS. Finally, at 1920 by 1080, we were pretty CPU bound, so most of the results are within 2 or 3 frames of another, just shy of 100 FPS. So not a lot to say here in terms of comparative data, but it is a good point to make that some games aren't going to show much difference between different cards being tested depending on the settings that you're using. And lastly, we have Starfield, one of my newest tests, running at 4K, 3840 by 2160. We again had pretty much the same performance from both 4080s, 70.1 and 70.2 FPS on average. Same story at 2560 by 1440. They're both at 103 FPS, 103.7 and 103.4. And finally at 1080, the 4080 non-Super decided to take just one more win from its lesser priced counterpart, hitting 125.3 average FPS, about a 1% victory. So there are the raw numbers for my tests, and now I will accumulate them in a few different ways to give you guys some points of comparison. Starting off with rasterization performance. With my 9 rasterization tests evenly weighted and then compared between the cards, we can see that, oh dear, the 4080 Super Founders Edition in my tests, and please, I highly recommend checking other reviews that are out there, because there's going to be other people who tried different games, maybe other people who didn't have like a really nice juicy 4080 Founders Edition non-Super that actually performed quite well. But it's a wash. We actually got 99.9% of the 4080 Founders Edition's performance out of the 4080 Super, and it's now becoming much more evident to me why NVIDIA decided to lower the price of this card by $200. It wouldn't be very exciting otherwise, would it? Next up is 4K ray tracing with the 4 ray tracing focus tests that I ran, and here again we have mostly a wash. There is a slight edge for the 4080 Super here, 100.8% of the performance of the RTX 4080 non-Super, which isn't much to write home about or get excited about, which is why the price is less. Let's take a look at those same 2 slides, but this time looking at the 1440 resolution instead of 4K. Here for rasterization, the two 4080s were again neck and neck with the 4080 Super, just managing to eke out a win with 100.3% of the performance of the 4080 Founders Edition non-Super card. Switching over to ray tracing, the difference is exactly the same, 100.3% in terms of performance. But part of the reason I spent so much time testing all these different cards is so you can also look at other cards down this stack to see how the performance compares there, especially if you're looking at AMD cards, considering how important ray tracing is to you and whether or not the increased cost per frame of the NVIDIA cards, as we'll see in just a moment, is worth it compared to the raw rasterization performance of AMD. Rounding things out, here's our 1080 rasterization comparison numbers. Please note that there are multiple games here that I ran that got pretty CPU bound at 1080, so this isn't quite as much of a pure comparison in terms of GPU performance between the cards, and also the 4080 Super was not quite able to beat the 4080 non-Super in this set of tests. It hit 99.5% of its previous contender's result. Switching over to ray tracing at 1080, the 4080 Super wasn't quite able to keep up. Would have been nice to hit 100% at least. 99.8% though is still, I guess, close enough. But lastly here, we're going to bring the prices of the cards into play as well. And for the pricing, I was checking current pricing just prior to this video being made. And if there were at least a couple listings of the card at a lower price, I was using that lower price versus MSRP. Which is why, for example, the 7900 XT is at $725 right now. It has been as low as $710, but those seem to have dried up in the past week. But anyway, here's all the prices. You can see them listed next to each individual GPU. And at 4K, we have a cost per frame based on the accumulated frame rate results of all the tests. Please note that the games are not evenly weighted here, but all the cards are. So this is the cumulative performance across all tests. And a couple things should be pretty evident here. First is that AMD is providing a better cost per frame. Generally speaking, the RX 7800 XT is the best value out of this bunch. However, it does give you a much lower average frame rate. So if you are looking for more performance, the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX absolutely do offer that. They're at slightly higher costs per frame, but if you do creep up to those, then you need to start comparing those to the mid and upper tier of NVIDIA's cards. So the 4070 Super, which I think is the best received out of this recent batch, has a cost per frame at 4K of $8.16, And I think part of the reason this card has so much appeal is that AMD doesn't really have a good answer there. Their best response is the 7800 XT, which is $500 and does give you a little bit less performance. So I can definitely see why the 4070 Super is maintaining a fair amount of appeal, launching at $600. Meanwhile, the 4080 Super, simply by virtue of its lower price at $1,000, is providing a significant improvement in cost per frame compared to the 4080 non-Super, and that is why I think, despite this review showing that these cards are really similar in terms of performance, I do think that the 4080 Super is going to sell decently well because it is now hitting a point where the 4090 is still quite a ways off, and you're still going to see significant improvements of frame rates versus the lower end 40 series cards. The biggest question there is 4080 Super versus the 7900 XTX, because those are both really similar in terms of price and performance, but the 7900 XTX is still offering a better price per frame. Of course, those are the 4K results. Here is that same slide looking at the 1440 numbers, again comparing average total frame rates, the GPU price, as well as the cost per frame. Cost per frame is definitely less at 1440. Although here, once again, the RX 7800 XT is offering the best value with $3.80 per frame. We can see that big dip by the 4080 Super down to $5.33 per frame versus $6.44. Finally, here's the 1080 chart with the average frame rate, GPU price, and cost per frame. I would rely more on the 1440 and 4K slides for comparison, because here again, we're running into some CPU limitations, but since I have all the data, I wanted to provide you all three charts. Okay, I have spent a lot of time running these benchmark numbers for the past week or so it's kind of weird to get to this point in the video and say, I think that's pretty much all of the data I have to share with you guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below of the RTX 4080 Super, and between the three cards that launched, the 4080 Super, the 4070 Ti Super, and the 4070 Super, which of those has the most appeal for you? And do you think the 4080 Super is going to be a viable product, or is it still going to sit at the same position it kind of did before, where people will either opt for the 4090, who are going for like the most performance possible, or they'll opt for something that's a little bit better bang for the buck, a little bit further down the stack? I do have another RTX 4080 Super. MSI sent over their completely newly designed expert version of the card, so I will be doing one more follow-up video on that. So if you guys have any suggestions or comments or any feedback for me before I work on that video, leave those in the comment section down below. I'd like to close by saying a huge thank you to you guys for watching this video. And once again, these benchmark reviews take so much time and effort. So if you can help me out by hitting the thumbs up button, sharing this in various places across the internet if you so desire, and of course, comments in the comment section down below are greatly appreciated as well. Also, if you'd like to help support my channel, you can check out my store at paulshardware.net, where you can buy shirts, mugs, pint glasses, and all manner of high quality merchandise. Thank you guys once again for watching, and we'll see you all in the next video.